Video is going to cover the difference between a bar graph and a histogram, and I put one of each on the screen here. And on the left side over here, we have a bar graph. And on the right side of the screen, we have a histogram. And frequently, when they're both drawn out, a lot of times people ask, well, what's the difference? They look basically the same. And there are a few huge differences that this video is going to showcase. For a bar graph, when we're looking at the bottom, we are looking at categories or types of something. So for example, for this bar graph on the left, we're looking at the number of TV sets that were made on each day of the week, on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are always categories, and we're looking at the number of things that fall into each category. The histogram on the right is always looking at gaps or intervals, which means, make sure I spell that right, that there has to be a gap in the data, that you're always looking for the frequency, which means number of times something falls into that gap. So these are the heights of black cherry trees. That means that there are 3 trees that were between 60 and 65 feet. So bar graph gives us categories. A histogram is giving us gaps or intervals in those categories. Now, a very important part of the difference between a bar graph and a histogram is that a bar graph can be turned into a histogram much easier than the other way around. It's very, very hard to turn a histogram into a bar graph. So what we have here is a bar graph, and we want to turn this into a histogram. So the first thing we have to do is write out the data of the number of TV sets for each day. To make it easier on ourselves, we're going to write them out first, just regular. We had 300 on Monday, 400 on Tuesday, 250 on Wednesday, 200 on Wednesday, 250 on Thursday, Friday had 100, Saturday had 350, and finally Sunday had 150. And I took that data and I put it here on the next slide. So I wrote it out a little simpler. What we have to do from here is we have to think about, for the bottom, what would be gaps in the data that would make sense? Well, before we even do any of that, we know that the left side of our bar graph always has to be frequency, or number of times. So we know that we have a pretty small set of data, so we can go 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and 4, that it falls within each gap in the data. I'm going to write these out in order to help us get a better idea of what our gaps should be. So it goes 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400. And there are 7 pieces of data here. And we notice that each of these jumps by 50. So we could make each of the intervals between 50 as an amount. We also could do roughly 100. Now, there is a problem with doing exactly 100 for this data. Let me show you why real quick. If I made my first gap between 1 and 100, and the next gap 100 to 200, you notice that this piece of data would actually fall into both categories. Therefore, we have to slightly change one of these numbers just to make sure something can't fall into both categories. So I'm going to make this 99. Now the value of 100 will not fall into the first gap, and we can continue going from here. That means this has to be changed into 199. And now our gaps can continue like this, and hopefully I don't get too crunched on the edges. And right there is the hardest part of every histogram, is designing what the intervals or gaps should be. Once the intervals are decided, it's actually not terribly difficult to finish the graphing process. So for this one right here, I'm going to graph in the gap between 0 and 99. I had 0 numbers that fell within that gap, so I'm not going to shade anything here. Between 100 and 199, I had 2 numbers fall within that gap. So I'm going to shade. Actually, I'm going to use my mouse to help me do that a little bit easier. I'm going to shade 2 in this gap. Okay. The next gap between 200 and 299, I had 2 numbers fall in there as well. Between the next 2 numbers, I also had 2. And then finally, for the last gap, I had a single 400. So we have turned our histogram, or our bar graph, into a histogram, which gives us the ultimate question of what's the difference between these two things. And the bigger question is, which is better? And for that second question, the reality is neither one of these is actually better than the other. They tell you different things. If the question you're trying to answer is, which day do we sell the most TVs? Obviously, the bar graph would be better because it has Tuesday listed on the graph. If it said, what is most likely the number of TVs we're going to sell on a given day, the histogram is going to be much better for that here on the left. But the biggest thing you have to remember is a histogram is always going to be giving you frequency of the data, number of times, or number of times it falls within a gap in the data, where a bar graph is always going to be giving you categories or types of something. And if you can remember that difference, you shouldn't have a problem creating and understanding bar graphs and histograms.